in alternative comics, right? And I would say that when I started working on, let's say, Kramer's 4, which is when I really started like figuring out what I was doing, that was 2003. So I put that together in 2002. I would say for the couple years leading up to that, DQ and Fana were very much not looking at outside work, and they were very, the goal there was like, okay, those guys were publishing great cartoonists who draw narrative comics, right? And they're amazing craftsmen in a very clear way. Like you can show a Seth drawing to a Seth Page or Joe Matt Page or like any of that stuff to someone and they love it. And there started to be this weird thing emerging, in the early aughts, early 2000, 2001. I started, Gaston at Meltdown Comics in LA, like gave me a Matt Brinkman mini, and like it was the most bizarre thing because it sort of reminded me of like Frank, like a Jim Woodring comic, but it was drawn so rough. But the guy clearly could draw. It just didn't look like anything I'd seen before. And all this started to appear, not work that was promising, but work that was clearly like there. Like the work was clearly there. And Fantagraphics didn't seem to be looking at, they weren't publishing anybody new. We're canceling stuff. A couple of years before that, in '98, they canceled Poot, Trailer Trash. I know a third one, but I can't remember what it was. Grip Bath. And it just didn't feel like those guys were opening their eyes at all to a lot of interesting work that maybe on the surface looked a little weirder, but at the end was very, very traditional.
I mean, what's interesting about what you're saying,
and that's where like Kramer's was like, I gotta do this.
Yeah.
Like, as a fan, like Kramer's is totally like, Kramer's Ergot, this anthology that I do, is totally like a fanboy, like it's a fanzine, it totally is, because it's like, I love it, I want other people to see it, and that's where it comes from, and wanting to present it in a way that's exciting in a good way, because even Blab, not to diss Blab, but Blab was already drifting in an area that aesthetically wasn't that interesting to me, even though it was publishing artists I liked.
Right.
And I just wanted to do something that was like straightforward. I felt like nothing was just giving me the work, and as far as like professionally produced comics. So that's why I got into it. And then it's interesting, after 2003, when Kramer's 4 came out, I published Mark Bell, I published Brinkman. Both of those guys already had things going on with Highwater, but those things came out that summer. And then pretty soon after that, a lot of the artists I started working with, like Lauren got a book with Alternative, and Christopher started getting a lot more stuff. Mom started coming together. Like all these things started happening, so that when I wanted to do issue 5, because I liked the way 4 turned out, it was almost like, whoa, there's no need to do it, because within that 1 year, obviously, it wasn't Kramer's Ergot that did it. It was like there was a push, like all that stuff was emerging, and it sort of needed to crack. What were you gonna say? Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say it's interesting that there's two things. One, that like Fantagraphics emerged out of fandom and out of a love of really traditional comics fandom, basically, and so they found their taste as they went and found their footing. Whereas we've been very lucky to essentially have, both through the Comics Journal and through just reading all this stuff, to arrive having found our feet very young, if not our full footing, but enough of a basis. In other words, the territory has been mapped out for us. We can be like, oh, here's Chester Brown takes one path, Chris takes another path, Jim Woodring takes this path. That stuff didn't exist when Fanta. All that existed was Crumb and the Underground, essentially.
Right.
But those weren't. It wasn't that diverse movement. Whereas, the 20 years from 1980 to 2000 or whatever have been, insanely fertile and diverse.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. But what's funny about that is, despite the diversity, when Brinkman and Chippendale and Christopher and Paper Rat and these guys started emerging, it was, I think, very much almost in reaction to feeling like things had calcified into this sort of literary model. Certainly, I remember talking to Chippendale. I think Brian still hasn't read Chris Ware. He knows who he is. He's looked at it, but he doesn't give a shit.
Right.
But I think that's
But it's,
interesting.
it's not a diss.
It's not a diss. It's just not what he's interested in.
Right, exactly.
And I think what happened is that these guys kind of emerged with an entirely other set of concerns entirely separate from the kind of concerns that even the most diverse of the 80s and 90s artists all shared.
Yeah.
Totally separate from what Klaus, Ware, Woodring, the Hernandez brothers, all these.
You know what it was also? It was amazing to read comics that had a lot of weird genre elements, but not presented ironically at all.
No.
Whereas one of the things that was almost felt like something that felt like that was almost a given if you drew a comic in the mid '90s was that it had to be ironic that you were drawing a comic and that you knew you were working in a low
and the vision.
And it was funny. I mean, guys work with it well. Cartoonists I love work with it well.
Yeah.
But those guys were doing ridiculous stuff like slimy jelly skeletons.
It also has to do with self-image. I mean, these guys, the 80s and 90s guys were very much in the sort of Crumb personality vein, where whether they were actually like this or not, the persona they presented to the public was this sort of old man, hates anything modern. They like maybe 50s lounge music, maybe 20s, 78s. None of that. There's nothing wrong with any of that. And all those guys, I'm sure, would really admit that's the persona they present. It's obviously conscious. And part of what was interesting about these new guys is they had no sense of irony about doing what they do. They had no self-pity. They were thoroughly contemporary.
Right.
That's all.
And also
not,
the drawing,
the slightest bit
it's the kind of drawing that's it's fashionable outside of comics.
Right.
It's a style of drawing that's exciting.
That's what I always find so ironic about when people are like, it's so obscure. It's like, well, they're not actually the ones that are obscure. It's that guy doing the photo reference Captain America that's actually way more obscure and out of touch. And these guys are fully in touch with kind of mainline modernist contemporary art trends. And it's kind of funny, graphic design and everything else.
Totally, it has way more.
It's way more in touch with the world than the Captain America guy. Trust me.
Alvin, my memory is that you came into comics through print making. Is that a fair statement? I know it's probably a way too broad statement, but how did you end up publishing comics, actually?
Well, I was working with books. I was publishing art books, fine art books, and working with books and fine artists. And
that was for a company?
Yeah, that was for a company. And then, there's a lot. It goes. Sammy said most of it. It was just at that time that I was doing prints with cartoonists that I like. Just trying to do my own projects outside of the press, and I was amazed to find these mini comics of people. I guess the first two books that we did were Destined for Dizziness by Southern Salazar and Scanning Rage by Vanessa Davis. And just seeing their mini comics, and it was amazing to me that the work is so strong and that they hadn't been published, that they were just just wanted to get this up there. I was interested in seeing how to do a trade book because I just had experience with doing handmade books.
And Dan, is there any story or backstory to how you kind of ramped up your operation? Because you have a fairly sizable concern now, which doesn't seem like you were around, but it doesn't seem like you were publishing as much as you.
Yeah, I mean, I started the Gonsfeld with Tim and Patrick in 2000, and the first issue was published in 2000. I started in '99, and I'd interned